Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the series, Sex Ed Made Simple. This webinar series aims to support educators, school district administration, and staff learn about sexuality education, what it is, what it includes, why it's important, and how to teach it. We've heard from many of you asking for this information and wanting to learn some new skills. We also understand that many of you are not as comfortable with this topic as you'd like to be, and you're definitely not alone. We're here to help. Each webinar in this series will be hosted by myself, Sasha Grenier, with expert guest speakers. During the webinar, we will accept questions in the chat window and weave them throughout. If we don't get to answering all of them, we will get back to you later with responses and resources. You will remain muted for this webinar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the Oregon Educators Network Comprehensive Sexuality site. Following the QR code on this slide will get you to that site, or you can go to www.oregonednet.org and search for Comprehensive Sexuality Education. Likewise, if this webinar gives you an interest in beginning further conversations with your colleagues across the state, please visit the discussion forum page on the Oregon Educators Network Sex Ed discussion forum. We can all continue the conversation there. Today's presentation will focus on the intersections between media, sexuality, and technology. What should we as educators understand about social media use among our students? What can we do to promote healthy and respectful technology use? What is the research that backs all of this up anyway? And how is this relevant to our work in teaching sexuality education? We are very excited today to welcome two guest speakers who will speak about this, Leah Haas and Chris Gowan. They are the founders of the recently launched sexuality education consulting group, Beyond the Talk. Combined, they have over 30 years experience in sexuality education across the lifespan. Leah is one of the statewide coordinators of the Future My Choice curriculum, which is administered through the Oregon Department of Human Services. She is also a clinical social work associate providing mental health therapy relating to sexuality and gender. Chris is Director of Community Engaged Evaluation at Oregon Health and Sciences University. She is also the author of Sexual Decisions, the Ultimate Teen Guide, and has spoken internationally on the intersections of sexuality and technology. Thanks so much to both of them for sharing their time and expertise with us today. So I'm Sasha Grenier, and I'm the Sexuality Education Specialist at the Oregon Department of Education. My role here at ODE is to support school districts in implementing effective sexuality education and promoting health and safety among students across the state. So why do we care so much about sex ed? Sexuality education plays an important role in promoting health and well-being. It has been shown to be effective in improving academic success of students, preventing sexual abuse, dating violence and bullying, helping young people develop healthier relationships, delaying sexual initiation, reducing unintended pregnancies, as well as HIV and other STIs, and reducing sexual health disparities among lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning young people. Sex ed is about much more than sex. It provides information to young people to create and maintain healthy relationships, explore their own values and boundaries, understand their rights, understand their physical bodies, and seek health care when they need it. A recent study from Columbia University found that sex ed contributes to preventing sexual assault in college. Another report this year found that the National Health Education Standards contribute to factors that prevent sexual assault. How does all this work? Why is sex ed so integral to preventing sexual assault and violence? In last month's webinar, we focused on different skills for educators to work towards preventing sexual assault in the classroom. One of those skills was thinking, quote, upstream. In other words, looking at the societal norms, contexts, and root causes that lead to perpetration of sexual violence. For instance, we know that young people are surrounded by messages that don't lead to healthy relationships. We know that movies and music and TV and social media don't always give young people the information that they need to be healthy and happy. A study from the American Academy of Pediatrics, for instance, found that more than 75% of TV programs contain sexual content, but only 14% mention risks and responsibilities. What are the other 60% of sexual content demonstrating? When we are surrounded by messages that don't portray healthy relationships or real-life risks and responsibilities, it's no wonder that young people need trusted educators to fill in the gaps. So based on these facts and many of your questions that we've gotten over the year, this webinar will help us to navigate the current world where young people get much of their information on sexuality online. The new Oregon Health Education Standards asks us to delve into these topics into media literacy with our students and explore how media and technology influence our ideas about friendship and relationships as early as in second grade. As you can see on this slide, the health education standards require that we teach young people the advantages and disadvantages of technology and social media to our health and relationships. How do we as educators teach this content in a way that empowers young people to make the decisions that are the best ones for them? First, we need to understand what research says about social media use and its impacts on relationships among young people. What types of media are young people engaging with, and how can we help? So now I'd like to pass it over to our guest speakers, Chris Gowan and Leah Haas from Beyond the Talk. Thanks again for joining us today.
Hi, welcome and thanks for joining us on a Friday. This is Chris and you'll hear from Leah a little bit later. I just want to, if you can go to the next slide, thanks. Basically, social media among youth is often a concern for adults, but we don't always know the different types of social media use, their context, and how to address them in a sexuality education classroom. In this presentation, we will try to cover many complex topics in a short amount of time, but basically we're going to be looking at social media use in general, then dive a little bit into sexually explicit media, as well as sexting, and then end our presentation by providing ways to reframe thinking about social media use to encourage healthy and respectful technology use in a sexuality education classroom.
Good morning, everybody. This is Leah speaking. So we put this presentation together using the following as guidance. Research was used as the foundation of this presentation. We used a strengths-based lens to honor the strengths of young people who are navigating sexuality and technology, and to recognize that when it comes to technology, young people are often ahead of the curve. Our hope is to reduce stigma and shame on this topic. Shame is often a barrier to having open, honest, and safe conversations with young people, especially when it comes to sexuality. Sex ed that is free of shame is also emphasized in Oregon's health education standards. We strive to be trauma-informed and inclusive with the information that we will be sharing with you today. And finally, we use the harm reduction approach. Knowing that young people are accessing social media and sexually explicit media, how can we educate them so they can make healthier choices and develop stronger media literacy skills so that they can be safer and healthier throughout their lives? Today, we are going to be discussing social media, so let's define what we are talking about. Social media are any digital platform that allows for the exchange and sharing of thoughts, ideas, and information. This includes social media platforms and can also include video game chats, sexting, and vlogging, which is video blogging. So Common Sense Media released a report this year comparing social media use among youth in 2012 and then again in 2018. Here's what they found were the most common social media platforms. Snapchat as most common, then Instagram, and then Facebook. My Future, My Choice, which is a sexual health curriculum developed here in Oregon for sixth graders, has a teen advisory board that is made up of peer educators who participate in the My Future, My Choice program, typically about 10 teens. And back in 2014, they collected 200 surveys across Oregon on the topic of social media and healthy relationships. And their data actually found regional differences when it comes to social media platforms that are being used across the state. Social media is moving so fast, and it is often young people who stay ahead of the curve. And that's why when it comes to supporting safe social media use and healthy interactions online, we need to engage young people in the conversation. They are the experts.
So as Leah was saying, a lot does change over time when it comes to social media. These two graphs come from that same report by Common Sense Media that Leah referenced in the previous slide. And the figure on the left, what I really want to highlight is that light blue line that shows just over in the last 6 years how much Facebook use, for example, has declined, where before it was, in 2012, the primary social media platform that young people used, and now it is down in 3rd place behind Instagram and Snapchat. So it's important to just really take into consideration that social media is evolving and there are different platforms that are used, and not really think about one platform specifically, but social media more broadly. The other thing that I want to look at too is that, and keep the same slide, is that the figure on the right shows that how young people are communicating potentially is being influenced by social media. That over the last 6 years, again, the same color blue line, you can see that young people are decreasing their interest in communicating in person, whereas some of the other means of communication are sort of staying more flat or slightly increasing. It's interesting because young people at the same time have also expressed frustration over their friends and parents prioritizing social media and their phones when hanging out face-to-face. So it's sort of a catch-22. Do young people prefer social media use because that's what everyone's doing? Are they decreasing their in-person preferences because people are not really paying attention? It's too soon to say, but I think these two things are intertwined.
Social media usage among young people brings up concerns for adults, especially knowing what life was like before young people and adults alike became glued to their smartphones. During the time frame that we've seen an increase in screen time, we've also seen an increase in mental health illness among young people. And many people believe this is a result of high levels of screen time use. However, we haven't only seen negative changes during this time frame. We also saw a decrease in other risk factors, such as teen pregnancy and drug and alcohol consumption. We should exercise caution when assuming that screen time is only harmful and impacts us negatively. In fact, we will look at some other ways in which young people may see social media as positive and helpful. Overall, young people report that social media actually has a positive impact on them. As we can see in this graph, teens reported that social media helps them feel less lonely, less depressed, and more confident. This report also highlighted the fact that overall, teens felt that social media provides them with a platform to express their creativity. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to everyone. And the Common Sense Media Report actually evaluated the social and emotional well-being of the teens who participated in this research. And what they found was that teens with low social emotional well-being scores experienced more of the negative impacts of social media than the young people with higher social emotional well-being scores. So for teens who were already experiencing, let's say, depression, social media was more likely to exacerbate their symptoms and negative feelings. So as educators, let's be sure to take a balanced approach when talking about social media. There are both positives and negatives. So in 2014, when the Teen Advisory Board for My Future, My Choice collected 200 surveys across the state, here is what they found is the best part of social media when it comes to friendships and romantic relationships. Staying connected and having another way to communicate was the most positive part of social media in both friendships and romantic relationships, according to participants. This is emphasized in other research, which also shows that young people feel less lonely when using social media. It's also important to note that participants reported that another favorite part of social media was seeing how others interact in romantic relationships, which essentially means that for some young people, social media is actually a form of relationship education. So now, here's the worst part about social media, according to participants, when it comes to friendships and romantic relationships. And these aren't new problems. These are developmentally appropriate issues, such as feeling left out and drama, which existed before social media among different kinds of relationships. However, they may be exacerbated by social media. But with that said, social media itself didn't necessarily cause them. Addressing these topics in the classroom could help support these challenging aspects of social media. And this includes teaching about healthy relationships, including healthy breakups, respect, and consent. Also, young people could benefit from learning about healthy coping skills to tolerate and soothe painful emotions. In general, young people see social media as impacting friendships more positively than romantic relationships. Young people who participated in this survey were half as likely to view social media's impact on romantic relationships positively. How can we weave social media and healthy relationships into sex ed so young people have more support navigating things like jealousy, drama, and bullying online, while also encouraging respectful and healthy interactions online? We could do this by teaching skill-building lessons on these topics that also engage young people in the discussion.
So that was a very quick overview of social media and how it might affect youth and their relationships. And now we're going to look at a different intersection between sexuality and technology. And so this is sexually explicit media use. It's really a broad category that includes usually what we think of when we think of sexually explicit media use as pornography, which is often a legal term as well, but that sexting, which we'll talk about later, and also camming, like sharing webcams or live feeds of potentially sexual acts, are also included in sexual media use. But really, when it comes down to the research, that we're looking at the pornography component. And what I think is really important to think about is there's sort of two ways that young people access sexually explicit media, especially pornography, both accidentally as well as intentionally. And that it's hard to discern how much of it is intentional, or perhaps a young person tried to look up a certain sexual act online and maybe got, for lack of a better phrase, more than they bargained for, so that while their intentions were there, they ended up stumbling upon certain content accidentally. This intentionality, though, really does increase with age, not surprisingly, and that by the time a person reaches young adulthood, the vast majority of adults have viewed sexually explicit media sometime in their life. So this is a behavior that will potentially become more normative as young people get older. Also to note is that females are less likely to view sexually explicit media than males, and that females are more likely to view that sexually explicit media more negatively and find it degrading. This is also a time that Leah and I both want to say that we recognize that not all youth fall under the gender binary, but that the research is pretty much gender binary, and so there's really little that we know about non-binary youth. So excuse our language when we are talking about male and female. I'm trying to mimic the research language. So why do young people view sexually explicit media? When looking at it intentionally, we find that curiosity, sexual motivations, and education are the main reasons. Other reasons include humor, to develop sexual skills and confidence, to just generally break the rules, and to understand their sexual identities. As educators, it's really helpful to remember that some of these motivations, such as curiosity and education and identity exploration, could be dissipated via other forms of sexuality education, or perhaps through better, more valid and reliable websites. Researchers have spent a fair amount of time looking at things associated with sexually explicit media, but there isn't much evidence to show that viewing sexually explicit media causes any of them. For example, it could be that people with sexually permissive attitudes are more likely to view sexually explicit media as opposed to the other way around. Or it may be some other third factor that is causing these relationships between the huge list you see on your screen and viewing sexually explicit media. For example, a young person who might have experienced sexual violence may be more likely to be both depressed and to view sexually explicit media. I wrote a guide several years ago and just recently updated it. It's a guide to teaching sexually explicit media, and the guide really provides a much more thorough summary of the research, and Sasha will be making that available on the OEN. So if you have further questions about this research, feel free to ask us today, or you can also access the guide, which I think is like 12 pages. It's pretty brief, but goes into more depth about the research itself. So now we're going to move into sexting very quickly. Sexting can be done by cell phone, email, through social media, apps, or other means. It's really just the sending of sexual images, sometimes words, but really the focus tends to be on those images that are produced and sent electronically. And the problem of sexting definitions in research is that really we're looking at this both through a research lens and a legal lens. While the research definitions are often more inclusive of different activities, the legal definitions tend to be more strict. So for example, a photo of a young person without a shirt on may not qualify as sexting legally, but it could in a survey, such as when young people are asked if they've ever sent a nude or partially nude picture. And those things may or may not impact a youth if it is taken without consent and distributed, which then sort of goes into the legal definition. The problem with the legal definition is that the laws do not always differentiate between types of sexting, which can cause problems. In fact, many states do not even have laws specific to sexting, and as a result, as of 2016, 30 states rely on child pornography laws to address sexting, which basically means that anything of a young person under 18 is illegal, any image, and those child pornography repercussions result. So as an example, a young person who takes a picture of their own body can be charged with breaking child pornography laws in some states for having that picture of themselves on their own phone. This does not necessarily make sense when using common sense and taking into consideration young adolescents' curiosity and exploration, and some states are trying to write new laws specific to sexting. Oregon is one such state, while Washington really has yet to do this. Oregon is one of the 20 states that are trying to differentiate between different types of sexting, and by considering the motivations of the youth and other factors to try to determine the proper consequences to be faced. These new sexting laws require youth to engage in activities such as counseling, community service, and internet safety education over being sent to jail or maybe even needing to be registered as a sex offender. As long as coercion, blackmailing, and other serious offenses aren't involved, a young person may not face consequences as serious. We aren't legal experts, and I really want to stress that, so please do your own research to better understand these nuances. So what am I talking about when I'm saying, like, well, there's different types of sexting and things? It does lead us to thinking about how we may want to conceptualize sexting and not just see it as one activity. The researchers of Woloch and Finkelhor, from the Crimes Against Children's Research Center have created a typology of sexting in order to understand the types and motivations for sexting among young people, and I've adapted their work here today in this figure. In my figure, the red denotes what I see as unhealthy forms of sexting, while those in blue are not by definition necessarily harmful, except of course for the aforementioned legal component. Aggravated sexting, which I also refer to here as abusive on the left, has a criminal and or abusive element to it and can include sexual harassment, coercion, bullying, or improper conduct with a minor. It can also constitute sexual abuse, extortion, deception, or threats, malicious conduct arising from an interpersonal conflict, or creation and sending of images without the knowledge or against the will of the young people who are pictured. In contrast, those in blue are more experimental sexting forms. These incidents usually reflect adolescent tendencies to flirt, find romantic partners, experiment with sex, show intimacy, trust with a partner, and potentially get attention from peers. It's possible for an experimental act of sexting to turn into an aggravated case, in the case of, for example, revenge porn, but it wasn't done that initially. You'll see that also I consider sexting for attention seeking as harmful because the sexting is not really occurring in the context of a healthy, trusting, respectful relationship. It is important, I think, to differentiate these types of sexting so we can work on preventing harmful actions conducted by and to young people and work on effective prevention strategies for those types that are harmful, and then better understand those that may not inherently be harmful. So how often is sexting happening? Well, that's a very good question. Again, because of the different definitions of sexting and things. The best data we have, unfortunately, is all the way back from 2009 from the Pew Research Center, who looked at young people who were owning cell phones and found that a very small minority of young people reported having sent a picture or video, but that 15% have received the picture or video, which of course potentially speaks to that forwarding of certain images without consent. What's more interesting, I think now though too, as educators, is to think about this more recent study done in 2013, again, kind of a long time ago in social media years, but nevertheless, in McAfee Security looked at 18 to 24-year-olds, so those who are legally allowed to send images of themselves, and found that 70% received sexually suggestive photos and messages. And there was a gender difference here, but I think the takeaway that I want people to see is that by the time people reach young adulthood, is that the majority are then starting to engage in sexting. And therefore, we may want to consider how we want to talk about that in classrooms at the high school and perhaps middle school level. Like the research with sexually explicit media, we also have correlations with sexting, not causations. In other words, we cannot tell if young people who are more sexually curious participate in sexting, or if sexting leads young people to engage in higher rates of sexual behaviors. We also know that it is possible that sexting is associated with young people who are known to be at risk for engaging in other unhealthy behaviors. So it could just be that young people who are more likely to smoke, use alcohol, and possibly be suicidal may also just have sexting as another aspect of their lives. Finally, it is important to note that those young people who have experienced unhealthy relationship issues, such as forced sex and dating violence, are also more likely to engage in sexting. And this could be due to an unhealthy relationship in which a partner forces a young person to engage in sexting against their will. So it is important to look at, again, healthy relationships and sexual violence as a component to sexting, but not necessarily. And finally, here is another study that drew from a different sample than Pew. Pew's was skewed a lot younger. This is 10th and 11th graders in one city in Texas. It also included 18 to 19-year-olds who are in a different legal category in the United States. So I just want to draw attention to that before you see sort of these higher rates of sexting in this sample compared to what we just showed with Pew. What I think is interesting is in the graph on the left, you can see request for sext. You can see that an equal number of males and females have stated that they are sending sext. But the requests differ in that boys ask more often than girls, and the girls are asked more often. It is also important to note that girls are more likely to be bothered by the requests than boys. That's the graph on the right. And that shows the gender dynamic and possibly highlights issues related to the aggravated versus experimental sexting component, and really stresses that need to teach about consent and healthy relationships and respect in the classroom.
Our current response to addressing the intersection between technology and sexuality is typically using an abstinence-only approach. We focus our efforts on telling young people to not sext and not watch pornography. And we typically do so using a shame and fear-based tactic by focusing primarily on the punitive and negative aspects. We use this as a primary approach despite the fact that we know that young people are engaging in these behaviors, sometimes by accident, as is the case with pornography. And we also know that many people will begin to engage in these behaviors as adults. By focusing so heavily on the law, this prevents other important education around this topic from happening and may cause young people to not seek support should they be curious or choose to engage in sex tech behaviors out of fear of punitive repercussions. It is common for parents and guardians to focus their efforts on monitoring their kids through checking their phones or using special apps, and often only address sexting and pornography using a reactionary approach should it come up. The monitoring and reactionary responses of parents can lead to a secrecy dynamic, which means that young people may be getting less support than would be ideal. As educators, we may be missing out on really important and nuanced conversations with young people by placing such heavy emphasis on the legal aspects of sex and technology and furthering a culture of sex tech secrecy. This leads young people to rely more heavily on their peers and the internet for support. In addition to this, our response to sexting is often considered from a heterosexual and cisgender lens, which does not bring everyone into the conversation. We also often use a victim-blaming approach, focusing on the person who is caught in the sext, without acknowledging the fact that coercive sexting is common and that coercion is unhealthy.
So now that we covered a lot of information, we're trying to figure out, we want to spend the rest of the time trying to reframe the ways that we approach teaching about sex, tech, and social media with young people. And the first way we want to think about that is reframing all these phenomena really within the context of adolescent development. That participation in social media and sex tech can be natural components of growing up. For example, engaging in sexual behaviors in general is normative in adolescence. It is also the time when young people form a sexual identity, and young people focus more on romantic relationships and start to understand what it is to be in a healthy versus an unhealthy relationship through dating, observation of family and other close adult couples, peers, media, and sometimes health class. Also, it's important to think about the fact that a certain amount of risk-taking in young people is normative. Without it, a young person does not learn what is important in life and also doesn't forge a strong an identity. We often are afraid and really stigmatize risk, but examples of healthy risk-taking can include things like trying out for a play, trying a new science experiment, taking that risky shot in a basketball game, or even asking somebody out on a date. And as adults, we want to encourage the healthy risk-taking while trying to educate young people about avoiding unhealthy choices and unhealthy risk-taking. And finally, because it is normative for adolescents to focus on identity development, adults can be aware that pushing boundaries and showing your best self to the world and wanting to fit in, things that often happen in social media, are really all things a young person is likely to do in all aspects of their lives. If we spend all our time addressing sexting and other social media use through extra rules and restrictions, as Leah was saying, that isn't likely to be as effective and could possibly make things worse by driving the issues underground and making it forbidden fruit or causing shame in a young person. So thinking about how these actions that people are doing that often cause fear in older adults, such as looking at sexually explicit media and sexting and engaging in social media interactions romantically, we should be trying to see them less as things to fear and more things to understand in the context of this adolescent development. So how should we address things while talking to young people? First, when talking to young people about social media use and sex tech, it's important to let them know that although some young people do participate in these behaviors, most currently do not. Of course, in young adulthood, as we saw, this does change. So establishing this norm of not sexting does allow younger people to see how they are more likely to fit in with their peers if they do not engage with it. But at the same time, we should be thinking about the future and that at some point we should be able to focus on how to do other forms of sexual exploration in technology safely and consensually. Because as with many sexual behaviors, it might feel like everybody is doing it, but for the most part, a lot of it is talk. Young people should only, of course, do things they feel comfortable doing, and only if they feel so, if they're doing them under their own free will without any pressures or threats.
In order to prevent abusive sexting among young people, it's important to teach the foundations of healthy, respectful relationships. It's also important to teach this to help young people navigate the messages they may be receiving by watching pornography. Young people need to learn about consent, that unless a person says yes to engage in a sexual behavior, it should not happen. It is never okay to try to trick or pressure or force someone into doing something sexually that they do not want to do. We often see non-consensual sex depicted in pornography, but young people need to know that this is an unhealthy depiction of sexuality. Young people also need to learn that sometimes love is not enough in a relationship when it comes to sending a sext. It is also important to be able to trust a romantic partner. And trust uses a different part of the brain than love. Trust is more rational, while love, of course, is a very powerful emotion. When sending a sext, absolute trust in that individual is necessary, because if that person does not keep that confidence and goes outside the consent, there can be negative results. It is important to teach young people to respect themselves, both their bodies and their hearts, as well as respect their partners. If young people learn how to be sexually healthy, they are less likely to engage in violent and abusive behaviors with their partners. This is not just true of sexting, but all harmful behaviors. By teaching about consent, trust, love, and respect, we can teach young people to have healthy and safe relationships. Honoring young people's expertise in technology use is very important. We need to be able to empower young people to support each other and identify strategies for safe technology use. Especially because social media platforms are constantly changing and evolving, we need to be engaging young people so we can stay up to speed with the latest platforms. Engaging young people can really help with this process. It's also really important that we assume positive intent with young people. Most often, young people use social media for good. Let's celebrate the ways that young people are contributing to a consent culture. Also, sex is not shameful. And again, this goes back to Oregon's law, which says that we need to be teaching sexuality education that is free of shame. So let's work to reduce the shame when it comes to talking about sexually explicit media. And this will help to create a safe space for young people to discuss their sex tech ethics. And also let's remember that adults sex and adults view pornography. So how can we support young people being safer? And how can we prepare them to have healthy relationships with others as well as themselves as they move into adulthood. Sexting and sexually explicit media use are prevalent among youth, but they really are not the norm. With that said, some young people are engaging in sex tech behaviors, and many will eventually engage in these behaviors as adults. So how can we prepare young people for safer sex tech practices? Well, here are a few takeaways to consider as educators. It's important to think about and communicate the idea that some sexting is aggravated and abusive while some is not. How can we integrate teaching about consent with sexting? We can reduce non-consensual sexual activity, including sexting and viewing sexually explicit media, by stressing consent, respect, and trust. Supporting young people with this topic also includes teaching lessons about healthy technology use, including how it impacts our sexuality, relationships, and emotional well-being. And doing so with a balanced approach is important, so not just focusing on the negatives when teaching about this topic. It's also important to help sharpen the media literacies of young people by helping them identify inaccurate information found in pornography. And this includes messages that young people may be receiving about what sex should look like, violence, messages about what body type should look like, gender, sexual orientation, race, and abilities. So we really need to be helping young people navigate these different messages that they may be receiving by watching pornography. So for support with how to address sexually explicit media, I also want to encourage to check out the guide that Chris talked about later, a guide for teaching about sexually explicit media, the basics, which will be available to you. And also, My Future, My Choice is about to release a lesson for the middle school level on sexually explicit media, and that should be ready and available within the next few weeks. So if any of you are interested in a full 50 to 55-minute lesson on this topic, please contact us for a copy of this to help support this conversation in the classroom. And finally, be the non-judgmental space to have these complex and nuanced conversations with young people. Having these open and honest conversations with young people will support them to be safer and healthier, not only in their relationships with other people, but also with themselves throughout their lives.
And Leah, I'm putting you on the spot. I think that My Future, My Choice curriculum also has, in one of the lessons, has some information or covers sexting as well.
Yes. So if any of you are interested, if you go to the My Future, My Choice website, we do have a lesson that does talk a little bit about sexting and also just the impact of media in general. That's lesson 5 of My Future, My Choice. And we do also cover healthy relationships in lesson 7 and consent in lesson 10. And of course, those topics are also sprinkled throughout the curriculum as well. And that's available for free on the My Future, My Choice website.
Okay, great.
All right. Thank you both so much. That was wonderful, really, really informative. For everyone who's still on the call, please feel free to chat your questions into the chat box. We'll stay on the line for a few minutes. Our speakers are here and excited to take on any questions that you have. So please feel free to ask anything now.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a question. So I'm wondering, so your newly launched consulting organization, what do you all do there?
So a couple of things. One is we have given a few presentations to some healthcare providers about a lot of topics related to sexuality and technology. We're also hoping to do some more presentations about some of the less talked about topics related to sex ed, such as consent, sex and technology, navigating different behaviors. And we really also want to capture the ability to work with adults in terms of their missed opportunities that they may not have had in their own sex ed classes. So we are looking at the adult population. Yes.
We are also currently exploring ways that we can support parents and guardians navigating conversations around sexuality with their young people, with their kids. And so we are working on developing an app that can support parents using topics from the media to have frequent conversations about healthy sexuality and sexual health in general, and consent, of course. So that is something that we are working on currently and hopefully will launch in the future.
So we got one question about where to find resources. I will be posting a lot of them on the Oregon EdNet site that I referred to in the beginning of today's presentation. You can actually access that site by just scanning the QR code on the screen right now, or just go to the website that I typed in the chat box, oregonednet.org. You'd have to find the comprehensive sexuality education site on that, but it's easy with just a search and a couple clicks. Also, the resources that Leah was talking about regarding the curricula lessons can be found on the My Future, My Choice website, which I don't have the link for at this second, but I wrote the name of the program in the chat box, so you can also just Google that as well. We can also send that out to the participants after the webinar today.
The guide will be up in a couple of days, I take it, too?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, we will upload that as well. Do we have any other questions from participants online? We have a question from a guest. Can you recommend sites to go find internet safety education for adults to help teach kids?
Yes. So I would go to connectsafely.org. I think that is a place that has some really good work. The other, I can think of the researcher's name, which is Justin Patchin, P-A-T-C-H-I-N. And he has a website, which unfortunately I can't remember the name of right off the top of my head, but he will write guides for certain social media platforms, for example, him and his colleagues. And they, so they'll be like, what can happen with Instagram? What can happen in Snapchat? And then sort of, but really from a non-fear-based approach for that. And also looks at how young people communicate within video games as well. And so he's more of a bullying researcher, but I think there's a lot of ways that young people treat each other well and not so well, you know, online, that sort of had that overlap between bullying and healthy relationships.
So the researcher's name was?
Justin Patchin, P-A-T-C-H-I-N. So those would be the two that I would go to first for the general internet safety. I like these because they use a very non-fear-based approach.
Thank you, Chris. We have another question that's come in. When it comes to addressing sexting and social media sexual consent for non-binary students and youth, what would you say is currently the best approach?
Can you repeat that?
When it comes to addressing sexting and social media sexual content for non-binary students and youth, what would you say is currently the best approach?
You want to take it?
Yeah, I think that it's really important when we're talking about sexting to make sure that we're not just focusing on situations in which, you know, a female sends a sex to a male and then we, you know, blame the female and we basically say that, you know, boys will be boys. And, you know, I know that we're moving away from that approach, but oftentimes we aren't looking at scenarios or situations in which we include non-binary folks or people who are, you know, not considered heterosexual. So we just need to make sure that when we're exploring this topic and when we are having young people, for example, look at different scenarios, that we are really inclusive in the different kinds of people who may be engaging in sexting behaviors.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing too is that the little research that's out there on LGBTQ plus young people and internet use in general is that they are more likely to search, use the internet for information seeking as well as for social connection. And so if we can provide those assets by providing inclusive sexuality education in our classroom and also making the schools a more welcoming environment, that those, while it's not inherently unsafe and bad to look up things on online, is directing young people towards reliable and trustworthy websites, as well as creating that inclusive environment in the school and in the classroom can really help.
And this is Sasha. I just want to add one thing that we encourage at actually one of the standards requires is that in 6th grade we actually describe the definition of sexuality and what sexual intercourse actually is. And in that definition, we say vaginal, anal, and oral. And it is a bit a tough subject for some folks to talk about, but it's really essential that we do that so that we are able to say, hey, this is sexuality if we're not engaging in kind of male-female sex in the way that mainstream sex ed lessons, media talk about it, that still requires consent and it still requires protection and all of those things, that it isn't just, sex doesn't just look one way, it looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different people, so that when we think of the categories of sex, that's also included. And that's a way that people will feel like education applies to them in the classroom, and that it doesn't just describe one type of interaction between some folks. And that's a way that we really try to encourage educators to talk about the subject. Additionally, when you talk about anatomy, not just saying that anatomical parts belong to just boys or girls or males or females, because we know that a good percentage of our students in Oregon do identify as transgender, that sort of ways to describe body parts can also exclude a good portion of people. Okay, thank you so much. Are there any other questions from anyone in the group?
While people are maybe thinking of other questions, there was a third resource that I wanted to add for general online safety, and that's Net Family News. All these people, by the way, Justin Patchen, Ann Collier is part of Net Family News, and Connect Safely, which is Larry Magid. They all have very active Twitter accounts as well, so you can subscribe to their tweets and get the latest on that. But all three of them really look at that healthy just internet use broadly for young people using a lot of research and non-fear-based approaches. So I think those three are very good resources.
All right. We'll hold on for another minute or so, waiting for any final questions that anyone may have. I have a question just asking to type in those resources that we just heard from Chris. I just typed them up in the chat box. netfamilynews.org is there, the researcher Justin Patchen, and the website connectsafely.org. And then, of course, the final resource that I'll repeat again is the Oregon Educators Network site, the Comprehensive Sexuality Education site. Not only will I post this webinar recorded, all of the other prior webinars in this series are also there already, as well as other resources. And finally, what I think is a pretty cool resource on that site is a discussion forum where educators can ask questions to each other. So please, I encourage you all to visit that site and ask any questions and provide answers and share your experiences with your colleagues. Looks like we have one more question that came in. Would you happen to have any particular advice for getting through to students who happen to be in particularly difficult situations to reach regarding the whole topic of LGBTQI identities? Would you happen to have any particular advice for getting through to students who happen to be particularly difficult to reach regarding the topic of LGBTQI identities? So any advice that we have do you mean kind of spreading awareness to folks that may not know much about that topic, or do you mean LGBTQI students?
Or students, yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to just normalize, I mean, easy steps, but slow. It's going to be a slow process in a lot of cases, but normalizing language through asking about preferred pronouns and making that sort of a culture of the classroom. Again, being inclusive as much as you possibly can in classroom settings, but also recognizing and teaching some of those just tenets of respect and trust and everyone matters and creating safe spaces and just being, you know, having a, I don't like to use the word zero tolerance, but like just having, you know, really interjecting when there's derogatory, intervening with derogatory language and things like that, I think are all really just important, strong messages to send in your classroom to create that safe environment.
Yeah, and additionally, you know, when we talk about different sorts of identities, people can really easily get behind the idea that we respect everybody and that they deserve to be respected in class and to learn. So kind of drawing those analogies whenever we can, like, oh, we respect anybody who likes this color or does this thing. Likewise, we respect and allow anyone to be in class and to learn equally, no matter how they express themselves or how they identify. Phrasing things as in terms of expression, identity, but also safety and inclusion in the classroom is a helpful approach to do that. And just we're drawing parallels wherever you can with other aspects of one's identity, other aspects of one's self and expression. Let's see, anything else I could think of?
I'm trying to think, like, because there's other resources. I mean, GLSEN's going to have a lot of good resources for that, as well as the Family Acceptance Project, which is, as the name implies, is more about having families support their non-heterosexual and non-cisgendered children. But there's a lot of good tips in there, and as Sasha's saying, really, it's acknowledging that a young person is more than their sexual orientation and gender identity. A young person is a whole human being that has many interests and dimensions to them, and honoring that young person for who they are as a whole is important.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this a lot during this webinar, but really normalizing in other contexts, in any context we can, giving the role plays or the examples of students and their relationships with each other, if you're doing any sort of scenarios, really just using those opportunities wherever we can to demonstrate that these, you know, different identities and different values, you know, a lot of different people come from a lot of different backgrounds and have different sexual orientations and different gender identities, and that's, you know, something that we all, for safety reasons, are responsible for respecting. And we will have more webinars in this series that will continue to cover topics similar to these in the future. So really, we encourage you to tune in. It'll be the last Fridays starting again in January. We're taking the month off for December from the series. And I will be sending out a new list of topics and speakers and dates. We may be moving this time slot to 3 to 4, we're thinking, to more accommodate educators' schedules and teachers that teach in the classroom. So stay tuned for that news and that schedule of when the webinar series will be continuing in January. So thank you all for tuning in today on a Friday. We hope you have a lovely weekend. And for any more questions, feel free to reach out to me or to post questions on the discussion forum on OEN. Thank you all so much and have a great day.